Good evening, everyone. Welcome once again to the Barbados ICT Professionals Association's members meeting. And at our meetings, we welcome any like-minded individuals, and we also encourage you to become active members, because the purpose of this association is invariably to work to develop the industry for Barbados and by extension the region, the Caribbean region, because right now the Caribbean region, as far as IT goes, we continue to be functioning in silos, and that is something that we need to change, because when we look globally, we have Latin, we have the African Pacific groupings, we have the Asian groupings, but then the European groupings, and so on. But the Caribbean region continues to be that region that, as far as ICT is concerned, we continue to be functioning in silos, and we're working really to try to address that. This evening, we have lined up for you a panel discussion where we will be discussing the general data protection / privacy regulations that have recently been handed down by the European Union. And this regulation invariably speaks to how data on the European Union's citizens are handled globally. We have here a panel of Barbadians who have been sensitized to the regulation. First, we have Mr. Shad Blackman. He is a legal practitioner. We have Mr. Andy Paris. He is an ICT professional. He functions and works within the Barbadian and regional space. We have Mr. David Gittins. He's an IT security expert. He is one of the founding members of the Barbados Information Systems Securities Association. Invariably, Mr. Andy Paris, he is part of the current executive of the Barbados ICT Professionals Association. And we have Ms. Liska Evanson. She too is an ICT professional functioning within this space, and she is an ISOC member, Information Society, that is a global society. So all these societies functioning here in Barbados, the Barbados ICT Professional being that indigenous association. But we all work toward the same goal. So at this point, I want to hand over to Mr. Stephen Williams, who is the president of the association, and he will be moderating this evening's session. The focus being data privacy. In this instance, we are looking at the GDPR. Mr. Stephen Williams.
Hi, good evening, everyone. This evening, it's a pleasure for me to host this discussion because, I mean, it was a little bit surreal when it hit me. I mean, Chad, maybe about 4 months ago, it's so long, 5 months ago, sent me a link to an article that he wrote in The Advocate, I think subsequently picked up by The Nation as well, on the GDPR. And why I say it's surreal is that was about 4 or 5 months ago, and my little research to make sure I wasn't talking anything too stupid, right, alluded to the fact that Microsoft has been working on this now for 2 years. And the European Union has put this out to the general public, or let's say the globe, for the better part of 2 years, and we have now started to ring the bell that this is an issue. And that kind of led us to some discussions internally to really start sensitizing the public quickly, because we have now had at least one casualty of not necessarily a casualty in terms of business, but one of my customers had to basically terminate their e-commerce service because the facilitator has decided not to comply with it, with the GDPR, I guess, standards. that means, and they're in the hotel space. So it means that that's a lost revenue for them. So therefore, this is a real thing that's happening. The average American company is costing them $16 million to become compliant. And what some newspapers have done, and there's a list of newspapers, they've decided to heck with compliance. We're not even doing business with the UK anymore. It is that ridiculous that your companies are opting not to do business with the UK anymore. It's not the UK, but the EU anymore. Not just the UK, sorry, EU. Because the cost of compliance is heavy. But we know in the Caribbean, specifically Barbados, that we cannot decide that we are not going to do business with Europe, UK specifically, because a large part of how we pay our bills is in that jurisdiction. So in ringing the alarm, in sounding that bell, I found it necessary that BIPA play a role in bringing to the attention to Barbados the importance of being compliant, being exposed, because that's what it is really about. If we are not careful about how we manage data concerning Europeans, citizens in Barbados, we land ourselves in a situation where we don't want to be. So without any delay, I'm going to ask Mr. Chad Blackman, who is working with other institutions to actually start to sensitize the region, not just Barbados, but he's being called to sensitize the region on the importance of this new regulation, and hopefully we would get something out of it, but also start a discussion. So remember I said I don't want a funeral service. This is supposed to be a lively debate, all right? And I ask these guys some questions because when we go back, I want us to be champions of the GDPR and its importance for Barbados and its economy. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. All right, good evening, everyone. I see we have a long lineup this evening, so I'll try to be as concise as I possibly can because there's a lot to cover on the GDPR. Before we get into the meat of it, though, how many of you are aware of what GDPR is, generally? Yeah? Okay. How many of you think it's something very serious to take note of? On a scale of 1 to 10? 10? I would say 20. You understand? Now, I'm very glad that you guys had this forum for a number of reasons. As Stephen would have said, is this necessary? Can you guys hear me, or is this for your feed? Okay, that's no problem. In January this year, I would have spoken to the media, Barbados Today, Advocate, Nation, the usual suspects, on GDPR. And up to that point, the general public weren't aware about what it was. Now, that scared me because I moved back to Barbados last year from England. And this thing was approved in 2016 by the European Union, as Stephen would have said. And prior to that being approved in 2016, it was being discussed 4 years prior to that. So from 2012, the European Union was trying to put this thing together. But what the GDPR really is the harmonization of all of the data protection laws in each individual country in the EU coming together. Because Poland had its own data protection laws, the United Kingdom, France, Belgium, etc. And Europe said, no, it is no time for us to have a harmonization and a single code to protect the rights of the European Union citizens. But what they did this time is that they extended it across the world in terms of its scope. So for example, just like FATCA, those of you who know FATCA in terms of the banking regulations and the Americans, so regardless of wherever you go in the world, this thing still follows. GDPR is sort of the same thing. You cannot avoid it. How is that relevant to Barbados and the Caribbean? Very important. Every single day, businesses here conduct business with EU citizens. And you may think, well, I don't have a business that I conduct with them. You actually do. Hotels. Every day. And what constitutes data under the general data protection regulation? I just want to make it very simple so you can walk away with clear, concise things to think about. IP addresses. This is an IT forum, so I'm sure everyone here knows what IP address is. So put that into context. A guy sitting down somewhere in a cafe in Brussels tonight, looking to fly to Barbados, I don't know, 3 days from now. From the time he logs on to Accra Beach's website, Accra's, I mean, you can correct me if I'm wrong in terms of the IT people, that Accra's servers or whatever is stores his IP address, correct? In some shape or form. Yeah. Once Accra, therefore, starts to access and store his IP address, merely by searching, he hasn't even booked with Accra Beach Hotel. Merely by simply going on the site, you then trigger the GDPR. So the European Union is saying you now have to make sure that when you store persons' data, you protect it in a particular way as outlined in the GDPR. I think after the session tonight, I will email Stephen so that you can have a concise document and go through it, because there's too much technical things to go through now. But I just want to give you the flavor and the gist of it. So that's one. What also constitutes data under GDPR? Emails. Very simple thing. So even banks, every day in terms of e-commerce, triggers GDPR. When you walk in to a bank and you give them your credit card information, that is GDPR. There are lots of returning nationals here in Barbados. There are lots of British citizens, French citizens that come here and do business in Barbados every single day. Persons who rent cars. You give them your telephone number, your driver's license. All of that is personal data of EU citizens. So you can already see that we as a country cannot run from this thing. All right, so that's to set the context. Now, in terms of the obligation of the persons accessing the data, so companies, business persons, etc., you now under GDPR have to make sure, as I said, that you access this thing and you store persons' data in a particular format. One of the obligations that companies must now do, for example, you must ensure that there's ongoing confidentiality, integrity, resilience, and availability of systems. What that basically means is that you must constantly ensure that you are compliant with GDPR. So even though the date of implementation was the 25th of May, which was last week pretty much, it is not a destination. GDPR is an ongoing something. And you must always be compliant. I will get to the fines a little later on, and I think that perhaps will wake you up a bit. All right. Introduction of a process for regular testing, assessment, and evaluation of the effectiveness of these systems. So your data protection systems in your company, your business, must always be tested as a means of being GDPR compliant. So what, for example, restaurants do, sometimes you will see this, they would have persons unknown to their staff come in and act as bad customers, yeah, to test to see how their systems and their staff respond to pressure. The same thing companies are now doing business with EU citizens have to do. You have to now test your system to see how resilient it is to breaches and hacks and everything. Because if there's a breach, as I said, the penalties will come in to play, and you don't want that. So you must always build a system in to ensure that you're protecting against people's data, protecting persons' data. Now, a very other important aspect is that you must be able to restore persons' data in a very short period of time if there's a breach. So if someone hacks into your company, a hotel, an insurance company, a bank, e-commerce store, selling clothes online, it doesn't matter, and there's a breach, you must be able to restore that person's data in the shortest possible time. Failure to do that will constitute a second breach. So the breach itself is a breach, if that makes sense. And then not restoring it in a short period of time is another breach. And for every breach that you have, the fine kicks in. You understand? As I said, the juicy part comes through. I mean, we have a proper panel discussion, but I just want to give you the flavor of things. Now, for e-commerce in particular, the opt-in, opt-out option is very critical. Consent must be given by the consumer or the person from the EU. So for example, sometimes you go online and you're buying something. You would have, as your company, you would see a tick box already there by default. The EU is now saying that if you're selling a good or service to anyone online who is from the EU, you must leave that box unchecked so that they check in and say, well, I give consent for you to store my data. You can't opt in automatically anymore. That within itself, simple alone, is a breach. All right? Now, consent can be given in any form. In writing, body language. Obviously, on e-commerce, it's not body language, but however you deliver your service, it must be expressly given. And you must show how that consent was given. There must be a documentation and paper trail or cloud trail of how you accessed and was given the approval for persons to store the data. All of that forms part of the compliance. Now, Data must be obtained for legitimate and explicit specific purposes. So if you send out a newsletter to someone, all right? Companies do it all the time. And you, in that newsletter, collect their email. You cannot now then say, well, I have your email, or I got it from the newsletter, but you're going to use it for another purpose. Every single aspect of your relationship with them, there must be explicit consent given. So you can already start to see within your company or business the reformation of how you have to engage the Europeans when you do business with them. Because again, any of the things that I've mentioned constitutes a breach. You must also, in terms of legalese, in law you call it legalese, terms and conditions, fine print, you must now put things in plain layman language that the average EU citizen can understand. So already now, sometimes the lawyers are being hired by companies to dumb down the legal language to put on websites so that when persons are engaging, is clear as day. Because any legalese now in terms of e-commerce with EU citizens of your company is also a breach. Because again, they're trying to empower the rights of EU citizens to make sure that they are clear in understanding what they're doing when they engage with businesses across the world. Stephen rightly said, the panic button has been pushed and is being pushed all the time. Singapore is so afraid. I mean, Singapore is always ahead of the curve when it comes to technology. But Singapore is so afraid of this because of the levels of investments that they have in the EU, that they have dedicated 20% of their next fiscal year's budget to become compliant with GDPR. That's how serious it is. On the other hand, we had a guy here this year, he's no longer in Parliament now, who was the Minister of what? International Business. When I brought the article this year, he said, we can negotiate with the EU about this. You know what I'm saying? The rest of the world is fully ahead in making sure that they become compliant. And our leader, former leader rather, one of our leaders said that, Barbados can negotiate. There's nothing to negotiate about it. It is already in train, full steam ahead, as of May 25, as I said. So we must now, as a country and a region, get with the program. But there are opportunities from this, and I will bring that out later, because one of the things I want to say is that we must use the GDPR as a vehicle to reorder ourselves in our data protection regulations and laws in Barbados and the Caribbean, but use it as a tool to become a foreign investment hub in the world. So that when Europeans and Asians and Latin Americans and Africans come, they already know that Barbados and the Caribbean is already to a certain standard when it comes to their data. Data is a very serious thing for people in the outer world. Here in the Caribbean, for some reason, we just think like, oh, well, it doesn't matter. So basic things. You work at a bank, and you could call your friend and say, Stephen, I want you to check my bank account there for me and tell me how much money I got in. Under the GDPR, you can't do it anymore because you have to have protocols and level of clearance at certain levels to ensure that access of data is only for certain people. Like even when certain people who are allowed to have access to that data, there must be a log and a paper trail and the reason why they access that. So again, all of these systems have to be in place to show that you are compliant with this thing. But let me get to the juicy part, and I'll come back to it. The rest a little later. Very important. Every company that engages with EU citizens for business, you must now appoint a data protection officer. It is a must. And that data protection officer doesn't have to go to UE or Harvard or Yale. You just have to read up on it, do some training, and make sure that you have a data protection officer. So if you have a company of 1, you can become the data protection officer. If you have a company of 5,000, make sure one of those persons becomes the data protection officer. But make sure there is a data protection officer. Because failure to do such, and you access the data of any EU citizen, and the EU comes looking, that's a breach within itself. All right? When there is a breach, or if you become aware that there could be a potential breach, you have 72 hours to ensure that the regulators in the EU are aware of that. And that's something that they like to see as well, that you are taking this thing seriously because you're trying to protect their citizens' data. So 72 hours is the time that you have up to do that. Now, penalties. The fun part, yeah? There are 2 tiers of penalties in terms of a breach. And this should be very significant for us here in the Caribbean. I mean, for everybody in the world. At the lower level, which is tier 2, and I want you to really listen to what I'm saying here. So you have high threshold of breach, which is tier 1, and then tier 2 is any other breach. The penalty is 2% of your gross annual profit. Yeah? It's not, you're not even getting the iceberg yet, man. 2% of your gross annual profit, or 10 million euros, or whichever is greater. Let that sink in for a bit. The EU ain't making the jokes. Again, 2% of your gross annual profit, or 10 million euros, not Belgian dollars, or Guyanese dollars, or Bahamian dollars, 10 million euros, or whichever is greater. What they're doing is saying, look, we can make you pay regardless how, you understand? They're looking, so if you're a big company, 2% is a lot of money. If you're a small company, you might think, well, I can just pay the 2%. No. The 10 million euros would apply to you. So if you're a car company in Barbados, and your annual profit is $1 million Barbados dollars, and you fall of one of these breaches, as I said, one, you will then be paying 10 million euros. Your penalty will be greater than your profit. What happens? Insolvency. You wipe out, basically. So therefore, it's something that every company and business in Barbados and the region doing business with EU citizens have to pay attention to, as of last night or last week or last year. There's no room for luxury, so oh, that don't apply to me. You understand? So you see the importance of it. Now, at the higher end, if there's a serious breach, if there's a blatant breach, if some of your staff is logging into people's accounts and sharing information with other companies, that's a blatant breach of their privacy. You will get the higher penalty. So you're talking about 4% of your gross annual profit, or 20 million euros. What's the conversion rate right now?
That makes sense. You still can't get fast
But so you see the point I'm making? We're talking about a lot of money. And we put that in context of us talking about moving in the direction of being a globally competitive country, where we want to do business with the EU under provisions of the Economic Partnership Agreement, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We have to make sure that we are compliant. If we want to trade with the European Union, they're saying, look, make sure you handle your business so that when we are coming to you, whether physically or online, that you don't breach our citizens' data. So you have to make sure. And I think this forum is an excellent place because you guys are providing opportunity for your members to be prepared. Because this, if you think the blacklist of the EU relative to tax was, as I said before, a category 1, look at it like that. This is a category 5. In real economic terms, it is really, really serious. This can wipe out a country. We're already in the middle of an economic mayhem. When this starts to apply, if it applies, hopefully none of us fall foul of it, you can be seriously seeing massive sets of layoffs in Barbados. Because why? Your penalties will be greater than how much you make. It will therefore make no sense to stay in business. All right? So that is it in terms of the overall aspect of it. But there's hope. There are companies like mine, there's no plug for it, yeah, that help individuals and companies to become compliant. I came back from Miami last night where there was a forum where I attended, the Caribbean Association of Banks. And they flew down to Miami, all their CEOs, to deal with this issue. That's how serious it is. Because again, the banks had issues like de-risking to deal with. All sorts of madness they have to deal with. And now they got GDPR. So in the region, we can not afford to sleep on this. All right? So I will say that for now, and I look forward to hearing the other panelists on the topic.
After the penalties, I can see that you're up a little bit because, when the alarm was sounded, right? When I sounded that alarm, right? I was not even aware of the penalties. All I know is that Barbados does not even have a Data Privacy Act, right? So I had to put that in the context of the fact that we have to become compliant with international law, and we don't even have any requisite for our local operating environment to even recognize data as a critical input to doing business. Is that amazing? We are in here discussing a law that does not even apply to Barbados as yet. Sink in. It's like we're discussing murder is an international crime, but we're free to just stab up people locally because it's not a law, it's not a thing. But the critical thing, right, that we have right now is that we have a lot of security people who would have spent more time on security. So that's why today's discussion is one of a few that my vice president and I have decided to actually put out there, because we go in heavily on the security side, which is ensuring the systems. But from what Chad alluded to, a data privacy officer is something that we wouldn't have in our organizations naturally. We could have testified that, well, what the CEO is going to do is like, you know what, that is you, IT manager. One of the reasons why I started it here, because the easy thing to do, the low-hanging fruit is just get to the IT fella. Maybe it should be the HR manager, because really and truly, as Chad mentioned, the real issue comes down to if staff indiscriminately share information. Let me give you an example that I came across myself. I went to the doctor, the receptionist, maybe she's a nurse, was on the phone discussing a patient file. I was waiting there and she was discussing the patient file. You know the thing about it is, we are assuming that she has a right to discuss that patient file without the doctor's permission, and that'd be wrong. Without the patient's permission. Most people still believe that the information in a doctor's office, even though it's on you, belongs to the doctor. Doctors believe that it belongs to them. So we have a philosophical issue right now that we're trying to navigate, because we want to protect the interests of Barbados, that we're looking into the GDPR, but we have a deep-rooted problem in the culture of Barbados and how we do business that is not being addressed. And the old Bajan maliciousness, you believe he walk in here and that boy sick for truth and he thought he healthy? I can put the file right now. Yeah, girlfriend, he got this. He got it. You know the interesting thing? That person is not breaking the law. Because some people go, hey, we have the Computer Misuse Act. No. The Computer Misuse Act speaks to unauthorized access of computer systems. That receptionist, through the permission of the doctor, has rights to access that computer, maybe to update the patient files. But what they do not have right to, and it is just an ethical right. It's not or ethical wrong, depending on how you look at it. They don't have a right to actually go and discuss a patient file with someone else. But it's not against the law. It's just a human right. So I go swiftly into the IT portion of it, all right? And I'm going to ask Mr. Andy Paris, a good colleague of mine who has spent many years in the trenches of IT, to come and give his perspective on where we are with small, sorry, Charles? Well, I would like to get through the proceedings before people start to scoot out. So, and I know that the draw is Chad and the other panelists, so therefore I would like you to hold your questions, or we can swiftly move along. We asked people for it not to be too long with the presentations. But Andy, would you please come to the podium and give your perspective on small business and GDPR?
Okay, thank you. Okay, as we have several panelists, yes, I will need me to, I can operate it. Doesn't matter, whichever works. All right, you will help me, thanks. Okay, what I am going to be looking at tonight is and Stephen alluded to it just now in talking about the security. I'm going to be looking at data privacy. Now, there's a relationship between the two, and very often, especially within our space, because again of the lack of real data protection legislation per se, we tend to muddle the two. So, yes. What is, and I have their digital privacy, and this, I have just put a few. There are a number of definitions, okay? And just to give you an idea, one of the most popular ones there would be relate to the control of the flow of information. And this is